So welcome back. We just finished in the previous episode, finished speaking about a brief history of Native Americans in the larger picture of healing America's narratives. What I'd like to do today is take a brief break from summarizing aspects of the chapters and just to step back and remind anyone who might view and listen to this recording of the larger trajectory of the book. The title is Healing America's Narratives. Subtitle is The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And the book's proposal is basically that, and there are different ways to state this. One is, if you look carefully at the history of the United States and at the 200 years leading to its founding, give or take 200 years, the current state of the country in the third decade of the 21st century is more or less inevitable. In other words, it's not surprising that we are divided, violent, really kind of contradictory nation in many ways, not without some great attributes, but with a collective shadow that tens of millions of Americans just don't know is there. And the collective shadow includes traits such as ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, fear, violence, greed, excess, bullying, and untrustworthiness. Those are 9 traits that if you look carefully at American history, and specifically the 5 major focuses in the book, that would be the history of women, the history of Native Americans, the history of African Americans, the Vietnam War, and in the post 9/11 wars on terror. Now, there's much more in the book, but each of those histories gets its own chapter in the book. So the argument is that until we as a nation, both individually and collectively, own both our individual and our collective shadows and recognize that alongside of the good that is America, that is in America, there is also this shadow side that's not good and fairly normal in terms, if you look at any nation, what we're speaking about here is not an aberration. The problem is America has been looked to since its inception as this experiment that became a superpower and was a power for good. It was a place where immigrants who lived in less fortunate circumstances wanted to come to have a better life. And they still do. Right? But if you look at the culture of violence within which we live, 103 gunshot wounds a day, about 2/3 of which are suicide. About 1/3 of those 2/3 are United States military combat veterans killing themselves when they come back. We have a nation suffering from various iterations of post-traumatic stress, whether it's combat veterans, whether it's the veterans of the mass shootings and the everyday individual shootings throughout this country, the survivors and the families of those folks. We have a horrible drug addiction problem. We are extraordinarily divisive in our politics. And I'm not, we can go on and on, but I capture some specific details in each of the shorter recordings that direct themselves toward individual chapters. As long as we continue to make believe everything is okay, and especially as long as those Americans for whom everything is more or less okay, who are making more than enough money, who have a nice home, who have not yet been the targets of gun violence or any kind of opioid addiction or other addictions, and whose lives are kind of okay, other than the day-to-day trials of problems at work or a difficult project or something going on with the kids at school. Until all of us are willing to step up and say, okay, we want this to get better. We want to end the divisiveness. We want to end the violence. We would like everyone to have access to affordable health care. Right? The only civilized, in quotation marks, civilized democracy on the planet that doesn't have some version of universal health care. And for those of you who struggle with healthcare, you know what it's like just trying to decide what policy best works, even if you're on Medicare, whether Medicare Advantage or straight Medicare. And among the Medicare Advantage programs, reading the thousands and thousands of words of fine print to figure out what you're really buying into. And just how complex it is to go to the doctor, whether it's just for an examination or for surgery, and then navigate through all the co-pays and deductibles. So that's just one example. So what I'm inviting you to do is look seriously, consider, especially, but not only, if your life is pretty much okay, what it would be like if it weren't pretty much okay, and what it's like for the tens of millions of Americans who are living in a way where they don't have access to affordable health care, where they're working at close to minimum wage jobs, where they work really hard, 2 or 3 jobs at a time, in cases when they're married, both parents working, trying to make a life for their kids. And the gross inequities of the share of wealth, where about 1%, the top 10% of American earners control about 68% of the nation's wealth. The bottom 3% of American earners have about, the bottom 50% of American earners have about 3% of America's wealth. And again, there's a lot more nuance, a lot more detail, but we're speaking about the collective shadow of the United States of America and the various stories that compete within the nation. And until we're able to really listen to and appreciate each other's stories and begin to heal them, come to terms with these stories as they are, and honor the humanity of each other, we will remain stuck in this violent, addicted, divisive country as we continue to move into this 3rd decade of the 21st century. So I know it's kind of a downer to hear all of that, to hear that, but it's accurate. And until we, beginning with each individual mind, heart, soul, gut, who cares about human beings, until we do that, and until we stop pointing our fingers at each other, and which is not to say that everyone is telling the truth. There are lots of stories out there. In fact, everything that we believe or value is a story of some sort. And we're not saying every story is equal. Some stories are partial. Most stories are partial. But until we're able to listen, hear the stories we tell ourselves, and open ourselves to the truth, even when they're partial, stories of other folks, we will remain stuck in this violent, pretty much unhealthy culture. So I hope you'll continue listening despite that kind of horrible depiction, because until we look at what is, we won't be able to grow through it and get beyond it. So thank you for tuning in. We'll begin in the next episode speaking about chapter 5 of the book, which is a brief look at the history of African Americans in this country, beginning with the earliest arrival of slaves, enslaved peoples, to the North American continent before the United States actually existed as a nation. So again, thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you the next time. And most of these tend to be about 3-minute video posts. This one is a little bit longer, simply to remind everyone what we're doing with these videos. So thank you again.